Have you ever noticed how some people don't need to raise their voice, don't need to force respect, don't need to convince anyone, and yet everyone listens, as if something invisible shifts the moment they walk into a room, making people pay attention, lean in, and naturally follow without questioning? Why does this happen, and what do they have that others don't? Considering that, if you really stop to think about it, the most powerful leaders in the world are not the loudest, not the most aggressive, and not even necessarily the smartest in the room, which reveals a truth that most people ignore. Their power comes from something invisible, something subtle, something that operates beneath the surface of words and actions. And today you're going to understand exactly what that is, but more importantly, you're going to learn how to use it, because once you see it, you can't unsee it, and once you master it, you stop chasing attention altogether, since attention begins to come to you naturally, almost as if it were drawn by something beyond conscious effort. Think about the last time you met someone who instantly commanded respect, not through fear or pressure but through presence alone, and ask yourself what they actually did, whether they talked a lot or spoke less but with precision, whether they tried to prove themselves or acted as if they didn't need to prove anything at all. Here's the first secret, and it may sound strange at first, because true influence starts with absence rather than presence, which becomes clear when you notice. The people who talk too much lose power, people who try too hard lose credibility, and people who constantly chase validation lose authority in ways they don't even realize. On the other hand, the ones who are comfortable with silence, who don't feel the need to prove anything, and who can walk away without hesitation begin to develop a kind of magnetic presence, and this happens because the human brain is wired to value what feels scarce, meaning that when someone is always available, always talking and always trying, they become predictable, and predictability quickly becomes forgettable. But when someone is selective, controlled, and calm, they create curiosity, and curiosity becomes the starting point of influence, because people are naturally drawn to what they don't fully understand and what doesn't immediately reveal itself. Now here's where it gets deeper, because influence is not about controlling people, but about controlling perception, which means you don't need to change who you are, you need to change how people interpret your presence, and the fastest way to do that is through emotional control. Have you ever seen someone lose their temper during a discussion and noticed how they instantly lose power and respect, even if they are technically right, compared to someone who remains calm, grounded, and unshaken under pressure, which naturally makes people trust them, listen to them, and follow them? This happens because calmness signals control and control signals leadership, which is why the most influential people are not reactive, since they don't chase reactions but instead create responses, and that subtle difference changes everything in how they are perceived. Let me tell you a story about a young man who worked in a company where everyone was loud and constantly trying to be noticed, where meetings felt chaotic with people interrupting each other and competing to prove who was smarter, while he barely spoke at all. At first, people ignored him and assumed he was shy or irrelevant, but something interesting started to happen over time, because every time he spoke the room would go silent, not because he demanded attention, but because he didn't waste words, and when he talked it mattered. He didn't react emotionally and instead responded strategically, and gradually people began asking for his opinion, not because he forced his presence but because he earned their attention, which reveals a powerful shift. Influence is not about being seen more, but about being remembered more. And you don't become memorable by talking nonstop, you become memorable by saying the right thing at the right time, which creates a lasting impression that stays with people long after the conversation ends. Now here's another layer that most people never understand, because your energy speaks before your words do, meaning you can say all the right things, but if your presence feels insecure, people will sense it. And if you try to sound confident while your body is tense, people will notice the inconsistency. You can even pretend to be powerful, but if you are seeking approval, it becomes obvious, because humans don't just listen to words. They read signals such as microexpressions, tone, posture, and timing, and all of that communicates one thing: certainty. And certainty is the true currency of influence, because people follow those who seem sure of themselves, not perfect or flawless, but simply certain in what they express and how they carry themselves. So the question becomes, how do you build that kind of certainty, not fake confidence, but real certainty? And the answer lies in alignment, where your actions match your words, your boundaries are clear, and your behavior is consistent. When that happens, you stop needing validation, and paradoxically, when you stop needing validation, people begin to give it to you without you asking, which shows that the less you chase respect, the more you receive it, the less you try to impress, the more impressive you become, and the less you speak to fill silence, the more powerful your silence becomes. Now let's talk about something even more powerful, which is the ability to walk away, because this is where most people lose influence by becoming attached to approval, outcomes, or being liked, and that attachment quietly destroys their authority. The moment people feel that you need something from them, they gain power over you, but when you don't need anything and are completely okay walking away, you become untouchable in a psychological sense, which shifts the dynamic so that people start chasing your approval instead. This is why high-level leaders don't beg, don't convince, and don't force, because they position themselves, and positioning is everything when it comes to influence. Consider a simple example where two people say the exact same thing, but one sounds desperate while the other sounds certain, and ask yourself who you would believe and follow, because even with identical words, the difference in energy creates a completely different outcome. That is influence in its purest form, and also reveals another important truth, which is that being liked is not the same as being respected. And if you try to be liked by everyone, you end up losing both. Respect comes from boundaries, from standards, from saying no, and from not tolerating everything, which naturally makes some people uncomfortable, but that discomfort is part of what defines leadership. Leaders are not here to please everyone, they are here to set direction, and direction requires clarity, which often means making decisions that not everyone will agree with. Now think about why some people can say very little and still dominate a conversation, because it's not magic but structure, since they don't speak randomly but intentionally, using pauses and allowing their words to land. They let silence do part of the work, and silence creates tension, while tension creates attention, even though most people are afraid of silence and rush to fill it to avoid discomfort. Powerful communicators do the opposite, because they say something meaningful and then stop, allowing people to think, process, and remember, which is where real influence takes place. Now imagine combining all of these elements, including controlled emotions, selective speech, strong presence, clear boundaries, and the ability to walk away, which results in someone who doesn't need to chase attention or convince anyone, because they influence without effort. And that becomes the real goal, not to become louder or more aggressive, but to become more precise, more intentional, and more controlled, because power is not about force but about leverage, and leverage comes from understanding human behavior. Here's something practical you can start using immediately, because the next time you are in a conversation you can choose not to rush to speak, instead observing and listening while others reveal themselves, and then when you do speak, being clear and direct without unnecessary words. When you do this, you'll notice that people begin to pay more attention because you are no longer competing for space, but positioning yourself differently within the interaction. Another powerful shift is to stop explaining yourself too much, since over-explaining signals insecurity and suggests that you need others to agree with you, while confident people simply state their position and move on. They don't argue endlessly or try to win every point, because they are selective about where they invest their energy, and that selectiveness creates authority over time. Now, ask yourself what habit you could remove today that would instantly increase your influence, whether it's talking too much, seeking approval, reacting emotionally, or constantly trying to impress others. Because the real transformation doesn't come from adding more behaviors, but from removing the ones that weaken your presence and reduce your impact. And here's the final truth, which is that influence is not something you turn on like a switch, but something you become over time, built through how you think, how you move, how you respond, and how you hold yourself even when no one is watching. Once it becomes part of who you are, you no longer need techniques, tricks, or scripts, because your presence alone does the work, and people feel it before you even say a word. That is when everything changes, as doors open, opportunities appear, and people begin to listen and follow without you asking or forcing anything. So the real question is whether you will continue chasing attention or choose to become the kind of person that attention naturally follows, because the moment you make that shift, you stop playing the game that everyone else is stuck in. And instead, you begin operating at a completely different level, where influence becomes effortless, natural, and undeniable. If this changed the way you see influence, then you already know what to do next, because knowledge without action is just entertainment, and you are not here to be entertained, but to transform. So start today by saying less, observing more, controlling your reactions, and most importantly, by stopping the need to be seen and becoming someone impossible to ignore.